In this video, we will be using scientific and systematic methods to test and review the Amazfit GTS4's capabilities when it comes to sports and health tracking. But before diving into the testing, let me give you some context. I recently reviewed the Amazfit GTR4, but unfortunately it didn't perform very well in my testing. However, the GTS4 is a lighter and smaller version of the GTR4 with a square screen instead of a round one. The lower weight and different fit of the GTS4 could actually improve its performance, so I'm excited to put it to the test. Now, to accurately evaluate the GTS4, I've collected data for 29 workouts, 11 nights of sleep and 13 GPS tracks, and we'll be comparing this data to reference devices to see how well the GTS4 performs. So if you want to know whether or not the Amazfit GTS4 is a smartwatch for you, this video will help you make that decision, and I'll be sharing all the data, insights and analysis you need to make an informed decision. Let's get started. Hello everyone. For those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. Now, as you might know, I don't like listing specs of watches, so let's get right to it. I will review 3 health and sports tracking features of the Amazfit GTS4 in this review: the heart rate tracking accuracy, the sleep stage tracking performance, and the GPS tracking. And since this is likely the most important feature for most people wanting to track their activities, I want to start off looking at the heart rate tracking accuracy of the GTS4. To test that, I'll compare the heart rate measurements of the Amazfit GTS4 against the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. And we'll start by looking at one of the easiest types of exercises for a watch to track, cycling indoors. And in total, we'll be looking at 8 interval spinning sessions. Now, this involves very little movement or tension on my arms and will therefore produce less noise. And here we see an overview of that accuracy over all of the rides. Each dot here is a single heart rate measurement, with along the horizontal axis the value according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and on the vertical axis the value according to the GTS4. Now, the closer the points are to this blue line, the better the agreement, and the darker black the color, the more dot set are. And as you can see, a significant fraction of the points is indeed along the blue line, which is good. However, similar to what we saw for the GTR4, there are also quite some points below the blue line and also actually close to this red line. Now, the red line indicates those moments where the GTS4 detects half of the actual heart rate. Now, this tends to happen when the signal is really noisy and the watch cannot detect the heart rate accurately, and it ends up detecting half the actual heart rate. Now, to get an actual quantitative value for the agreement with the ECG chest strap, I use the correlation, which is this R value up here, and the correlation in this case is 0.67. Now, that's not very good for this type of exercise. Now, it's not extremely terrible, but it's definitely not good. However, to get a better impression for how good or bad this actually is, let's take a look at some of the individual training sessions. And here we have the first example interval spinning session where we honestly see a pretty bad agreement between the GTS4 and the ECG chest strap. Along the horizontal axis we have the time and my heart rate is along the vertical axis. In blue-green you see the heart rate recorded by the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and in red is my heart rate according to the GTS4. As you can see from much of the ride, the red line of the GTS4 is below the blue-green line of the ECG chest strap, indicating that the GTS4 detected a too low heart rate. It seems it has trouble detecting sudden increases in my heart rate, similar to what we saw for the GTR4, since sometimes halfway through a segment it suddenly is able to pick up on this increased heart rate, but before that it keeps detecting the lower heart rate. You can see that right here, for instance, where it slowly increases to the peak in my heart rate, but also here about halfway through it suddenly increases my heart rate, and also right here and here, for instance, it never even catches up with the peak in my heart rate. And we can see something similar in this session right here, which honestly looks even worse. For this first part of the training it actually detected a too high heart rate, and for the second part of the training it never actually caught up with the peaks in my heart rate, as you can see right here, but also in this part of the training. Now, I have to say there were some sessions where it wasn't quite as bad, like this one right here, where for this segment right here it really struggled, and there was also a slight delay right here and also a slight delay right here, but overall it's not looking that bad. Now, there was one session, that's this one right here, where it actually did quite well for the entire training. Not perfect, but the best out of anything I've seen for this watch. So it was able to pick up on all the peaks in my heart rate, but again, this is the exception and not the rule. These results so far really remind me of what I showed you recently in my review of the Amazfit GTR4. namely that there's quite some inconsistency between the rides when it comes to the quality of the heart rate tracking. Some are quite good, but in other cases the heart rate tracking performance is really awful. Now I always try to position the watch correctly and to make sure that I cannot move it too much on my wrist, but it could be that the sensor is just super sensitive to the exact position of my wrist for some reason, which of course isn't ideal for a smartwatch. However, let's put these results into perspective by comparing them to 64 other watches I've tested in the past. That overview is displayed right here. Now the correlation value I was talking about before is the metric we will use for this, and that is displayed along the horizontal axis here. We want that value to be as close to 1 as possible. And on the vertical axis I order the watches from worst to best, so the further to the right and the higher the device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. And here I mark the Amazfit GTS4 in red. And as you can see, the GTS4 does not do well compared to many of the other smartwatches. And you might notice that there are many other Amazfit devices in this lower region of the plot. Now the Amazfit GTR4 actually seems to perform about the same, which makes some sense as they have the same sensor. Now just to give you an impression of what are the best devices out there at the moment, here I zoom into just the watches with a correlation of 0.9 or higher. And as you can see, the best devices include different Apple watches, but also some Huawei watches are quite good. Also, the Galaxy Watch 4 and Google Pixel Watch are not too bad at all. Honestly, I'm not really a fan of the Amazfit GTS4 so far, but let's not jump to conclusions. Next, let's briefly take a look at another type of exercise which is actually quite hard for some watches to track, namely running outside. Now here you can see the results for the first interval run that I did. Again, in blue, green are the measurements of the chest strap, and in red the GTS4. Now as you can see, and this looks similar to what we saw for the GTR4, the GTS4 was able to pick up on my rough intervals, but it wasn't able to get my exact heart rate at the peaks of the intervals. It generally seems to detect a too low heart rate at the peaks of my heart rate, except for this segment right here where I detected a too high heart rate. Now during this second run it might have done a bit better, but as you can see it generally follows along roughly with my heart rate patterns, so you can see each of the intervals that I ran, but the exact heart rate is still off by quite a bit. Which actually means I wouldn't really trust the GTS4 to track my heart rate while running. Next, let's take a look at a more challenging type of exercise, cycling outside. While cycling outdoors, watches tend to shift a lot more on the wrist, making accurate heart rate readings much more difficult. To see if and how this affected the GTS4, I tested it during a total of 13 bike rides. Okay, quick interruption, Rob from the future here. I just wanted to make one important remark. As you might have noticed, I performed all these tests at the end of 2022 and I wasn't able to redo them due to time constraints. The reason is I also had to test other devices, like for instance this Garmin Forerunner 965. So it was either use the data I had or don't make a video at all about the GTS4. So with that side note, I did want to get a review out there, since most reviews that are there anyway are from the same period and I didn't see major changes in performance when doing some quick testing last month. Still, there could have been some changes due to software updates I didn't pick up on, so I just wanted you to be aware. If I do see major changes in the future, I'll post them on my shorts channel. Now back to the video. Now here we see a similar overview plot to before, but now for biking outside. And as you can see, the points are really spread out over the bottom half of this plot, and many points are away from the blue line, indicating that the GTS4 quite often detects a too low heart rate. Similar to what we saw for the GTR4, again there are quite a few points around this red line, indicating that it sometimes detects half of the actual heart rate. And we can see that in even more detail if we look at some of the bike rides themselves. Now this first bike ride right here shows quite a big disagreement between the GTS4 and the ECG chest strap. There are some moments where the GTS4 in red comes quite close to the ECG chest strap in blue, but for most of the rides they're quite different. There were also some really bad rides, like this one right here, where the GTS4 detected a decreased heart rate each time it should have detected an increased heart rate instead, which is quite bad honestly. So you see there should be an increase right here, but we instead see a decrease each time. There were also some rides that looked quite, I would say, okay, like this one right here, which has a pretty okay agreement between both of the devices. However, many, or I would actually say most of the rides were quite bad in the end, like you also see for this example right here, which means things aren't looking that good for the GTS4. We can again put this into perspective by looking at many of the watches I've tested over the last years. Now, similar to before, we use the correlation with the ECG chest strap as the value on the horizontal axis, and the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. And as you can see, the Amazfit GTS4 marked here in red is really bad compared to most other devices. And again, we see that many other Amazfit devices like the GTR3, the GTR4 are in about the same place as the GTS4. So all of them are doing pretty poorly. So the new BioTracker 4.0 sensor set that the Amazfit GTS4 uses isn't really looking like a great improvement over the old sensor. But let's now see if it can do better by looking at one of the most difficult exercises for a watch to track, weightlifting. We actually saw before that out of all the exercises I tested it for, the Amazfit GTR4 did relatively okay for weightlifting, at least when comparing it to other watches in my recent review. As I've mentioned previously, this exercise is much more difficult because of the increased tension on my wrist and on my arm, making it much harder for the watch to get a clean heart rate signal. However, first a quick side note. If you're interested in the latest updates on the wearables I'm testing, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter and posting more off-the-cuff things on my Instagram and my YouTube Shorts channel. So if you're interested in any of those are linked below. Of course, you would also make me really happy and it would help my efforts if you subscribe to this YouTube channel. But of course, this is totally up to you. Now, enough self-promotion. Let's take a look at the performance during weightlifting, which I tested during a total of 5 training sessions. Now here we can see an overview of that accuracy similar to before. Now the overall performance doesn't actually look that bad based on this plot. They're also not that good. There are quite some points along the blue line, but again also many below it, indicating that the GTS4 quite often detects a too low heart rate. The correlation value at 0.69 is also mediocre, I would say. And if we look at the individual training sessions, we see that quite clearly. The peaks in my heart rate you can see in blue-green are mostly not detected by the GTS4 in red. So in between my sets, it is able to detect my heart rate when my heart rate is low. But the moment I start a set and the tension on my arm increases, it really struggles. And that's basically what we see for all training sessions. The peaks in my heart rate are really difficult for the GTS4 to pick up on. Sometimes it can pick up on some of them, as we can also see for this training session right here, for instance. But generally it will miss most of them. We can again put this into perspective by comparing it to many of the other watches I've tested in the past, and we can see those results in this overview right here. Again, the more to the top right, the better the consistency with the ECG chest strap. And as you can see, relative to other watches, the GTS4, which is marked here in red, is really in the middle of all watches. So it's not great compared to other watches, but also not terrible. When we zoom in a bit, we actually see it's very close to the Amazfit GTR4, which I tested recently. Again, confirming that independent of what watch it is in, the sensor is performing very similarly. Still though, a value like this is not very good. I would not use the GTS or GTR4 for weightlifting. If you really want to track your heart rate during weightlifting, your best option is honestly an ECG chest strap. Overall, I cannot really recommend the GTS4 for tracking your heart rate during exercise. It just doesn't appear to be very reliable, and though it might do well on occasion, it's actually quite bad for most exercises most of the time. Therefore, I'd give the heart rate tracking accuracy of the GTS4 2 out of 5 stars. And as I mentioned before, my go-to devices for heart rate tracking are Apple Watches, and for Android, some Huawei devices are also quite good. But how about sleep stage tracking? Is that any good on the GTS4? Well, let's take a look. Now to check if the Amazfit GTS4 can detect my sleep stages, I'll compare it to an EEG device called the Dream 2 that can actually measure my brain waves and has been shown to be relatively reliable at sleep stage tracking. And here I show an overview of the sleep test results. Now for getting an overall impression of how well the Amazfit GTS4 performs, the Dream 2 should likely be good enough. However, the gold standard would be polysomnography, which you would also like to try on the Amazfit GTS4 in the future. Now on top here are the sleep stages as recorded by the EEG device, and on the left are the sleep stages as recorded by the Amazfit GTS4. I wore both the EEG device and GTS4 to bed for 11 nights, and we'll see how close the predictions of the GTS4 are to those of the EEG device. Now each column here sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Dream 2 was predicted as each sleep stage by the Amazfit GTS4. And if they perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal should be 100%. First of all, we see that about 43% of what was deep sleep according to the EEG device was also predicted as deep sleep by the GTS4. This is honestly quite a low number since some watches get up to 70 or even 80% agreement. We actually see that more of the EEG detected deep sleep was predicted as being light sleep by the GTS4 at about 56%. And we can actually see that in a different way based on the individual nights. On top here we have the sleep stages according to the Dream 2 EEG headband with the clock time along the horizontal axis and the sleep stages on the vertical axis. And on the bottom we have a similar plot but now for the Amazfit GTS4. And here I've highlighted all the EEG recorded deep sleep in purple. As you can see, for this night, there's actually no agreement in terms of deep sleep between the EEG device and the GTS4. Where the EEG device detected deep sleep, the GTS4 detected almost exclusively light sleep for this night, so this doesn't look that good. And we see something similar for this night, though it does look a tiny bit better. There's some overlap now, and the patterns also look slightly more similar. However, still the overall agreement in terms of deep sleep is not very good. And we also see something similar for this last example night right here. In this case, actually more than half of the first segment of my night was detected as being deep sleep by the GTS4, with almost no REM sleep at all. Now this is a very unlikely sleep pattern, and I don't think the watch performed very well right here. Now light sleep agreement was the best out of all three sleep stages at 67%, which is not that bad. And if the Amazfit GTS4 did disagree with the EEG device on light sleep, it mostly predicted it as either REM sleep or deep sleep. This is again very similar to what we saw in my review of the GTR4. And we see the same thing for REM sleep agreements, which was again pretty bad at about 35%. This means that only about 35% of what the EEG device detected as being REM sleep was also detected as REM sleep by the GTS4. Actually, about 56% of what the EEG device detected as REM sleep was predicted as light sleep by the GTS4 instead. And we can see that clearly based on the individual nights as well. Now this is a similar plot to before, but now with the REM sleep as measured by the EEG device marked in red. And here we can see a pretty poor agreement between the EEG device and the GTS4. There are some moments of overlap, but in general it doesn't look that great. Especially for the first part of the night, we see that the GTS4 detected almost no REM sleep at all, which isn't very likely. There is some REM sleep, but overall it doesn't look that good. And for the second example night, we see something similar, where the GTS4 detected almost no REM sleep at all for the entire night, which is not very likely. And looking at the overlap with the EEG headband, we also see that it doesn't look that great. Now for this example night, we also see quite bad overlap, though in this case the GTS4 did detect more REM sleep, but just in moments where I wouldn't have expected it. And because of this poor agreement, we wouldn't be able to see the sleep cycles based on just the data from the GTS4. Now you go through roughly 4 to 6 sleep cycles each night, each one starting with light and deep sleep marked here in blue and ending in REM sleep marked here in red. And as you can see, I likely had 1, 2, 3, 4 complete sleep cycles this night. And we're not able to see this at all based on the data from the GTS4. Now for this night, the REM sleep detected by the GTS4 really seems somewhat randomly distributed to me. And looking at this other example night, again, I would expect at least 4 complete sleep cycles, but I wouldn't be able to see that based on the data from the GTS4. Awake detection is also not great, with only 40% of the awake time measured by the EEG device also detected by the GTS4. And actually more of that EEG detected awake time was being detected as light sleep by the GTS4 at about 42%. And we actually see something similar for the GTS4 compared to what we saw for the GTR4 in my recent review, where it appears to be less sensitive than the EEG device in picking up on my moments of wakefulness. It does pick up on some of the longer, clear awake moments, but for instance for this night when I lay in bed awake in the morning, the GTS4 still thought I was asleep, while the EEG device already classified me as being awake. And we mostly see something similar for this night right here, where my longer awake moments are picked up on, but some of the other shorter awake moments are not picked up on, and it also thought I slept a little bit longer. And I would say that's the overall pattern I see. Also right here, we see that this awake moment is detected, but this one isn't, though here it did detect an extra awake moment. So this again doesn't look that amazing. However, to put these results into context, we can compare the performance of the Amazfit GTS4 to that of 45 other watches I've tested previously. Now this graph shows you an overview of the agreement of different watches with the EEG device. Along the horizontal axis we have the average agreement over the 4 individual sleep stages, and on the vertical axis we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. Now the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. And as you can see, the devices with the best agreement so far were different Apple Watches, in this case the Apple Watch Series 7, Series 8, the Apple Watch SE and the Apple Watch Ultra. And other good devices include different Fitbits, Whoop straps, the Withings Sleep Analyzer and also the Google Pixel Watch. If we now plot the Amazfit GTS4 in the same plot, which is marked in red, we see it didn't perform that good compared to all of the other watches. It's super close in performance to the GTR4, again confirmed confirming that these watches likely have very similar performance. Both of them are also not that far away from the previous generation of the GTR, the GTR4, which might actually mean that all of them still use the same algorithm. But overall, if we look at the average agreement over the 4 sleep stages here along the horizontal axis, it's really amongst the worst performing watches, together with some Huawei watches, some Garmin devices and some Mi Bands. Overall though, the sleep stage tracking just isn't very good, and I wouldn't rely on these Amazfit devices to accurately track these. Therefore, I'd give the sleep stage tracking of the Amazfit GTS4 2 out of 5 stars. Now for better sleep stage tracking, I'd recommend an Apple Watch, or you could also go for instance, a Fitbit, a Whoop strap or the Google Pixel Watch, all of which seem to perform quite good as well. But let's now move on to another important feature of the Amazfit GTS4, the location or GPS tracking. To test that, I tracked my route during a total of 10 bike rides while I was cycling to and from work, and I wanted to test 2 things. 1, how long does it take for the watch to get a GPS signal? And 2, how well the GPS signals overlap when cycling the same route several times. And here you can see the results for 5 times I cycled to work. And these green markers indicate the moment it acquired the signal, and I never gave it any extra time to acquire it, so I started it and then started my ride. Now one of the rides I started over here, so we'll ignore that for now. Now I always start my ride from the corner right here. So this corner is where I start the ride, and in most cases it acquired the signal really quickly. So 3 times it was basically spot on in the location. 1 time it was a bit off, but overall it's fast at acquiring the first signal. But if we look at the consistency between the rides, so how well their signals overlap, this doesn't look that great, but let's have a look. And that's what you can see if we zoom out a bit. So if we zoom out, we actually see that the signals don't overlap that well. As you can see, they're actually quite spread out and not overlapping that well. And if we zoom out a bit more, we can look at a larger part of the ride. And as you can see, there is quite some spread still. Also here, going past the church right here, there's quite some spreads where the signal should overlap quite well. You can see that nicely here on the corner where I always turn on the same point, but the signals are quite spread out still. And this seems to be the general pattern for cycling to work. There's quite some deviation between the signals. Later on here, it gets a bit better, and especially here it looks quite okay. But overall, it doesn't look great, honestly. There are small stretches where they overlap quite well, but overall, they're quite spread apart. So at first glance, the signal quality isn't looking that great for the Amazfit GTS4, but let's now take a look at cycling back from work to see if that was any better. And that is what you see right here. Again, the green markers indicate the moment it acquired the GPS signal for each of the 5 rides. And as you can see, they're all pretty close to each other, so that looks good. However, the actual consistency between the signals later on is not very good, but let's take a look. So if we zoom out a bit, we can look at that ride. And as you can see, there are some signals really going through buildings or through parks where I didn't actually ride. So that's not looking that great, honestly. The signals are spread out quite a bit more than we see for some other watches. We actually see that this ride right here always seems to be a bit nudged away from the others for a large part of the ride right here. And if you look at this section right here, we also see quite a big spread. There's 2 rides right here deviating from the other 3 where they're really going through buildings where I couldn't have cycled. And looking a bit further down my route, we indeed see quite some deviation. There's one here going over the roundabout, the others are a bit closer to where I actually cycled. However, here there are 2 signals really deviating from the rest and also from the road going through buildings. So this is really not looking that good. And also here closer to the end of my route, again, it isn't looking that good. There's a big deviation between the signals, and I wouldn't really trust that the Amazfit GTS4 can accurately track my route. But does that mean that you cannot use the GPS tracking of the GTS4 at all? Well, no. If you just want a rough impression of your ride or run and you want pretty fast signal acquisition, it will do fine, I guess. However, if you do care about the exact distance you ran or rode, I wouldn't recommend it. Therefore, overall, I'd give the GPS tracking 2.5 out of 5 stars. After reviewing the GTS4 here and also the GTR4 recently, I'm honestly quite disappointed that both these amazing looking Amazfit devices perform so poorly when it comes to health and sports tracking. The screens and design of these watches are really nice, but similar to the GTR4, the GTS4 also greatly disappoints when it comes to overall measurements it takes. Therefore, I'd give the health and sports tracking of the Amazfit GTS4 2 out of 5 stars. Now, maybe you don't actually care about the health metrics, you just want a pretty budget-friendly watch, but I suspect that if this was the case, you wouldn't have made it until the end of this video. Therefore, I in general cannot recommend these Amazfit devices to my subscribers. I actually would recommend Apple Watches, and specifically the Apple Watch SE. I've gotten the best heart rate tracking and also sleep stage tracking on the wrist from Apple Watches, but be aware that these do require an iPhone. Now, if you want the best overall good performing device that also tracks your health really well in addition to being a decent heart rate tracker, I'd recommend the Whoop strap. If you do decide to buy an Apple Watch, a Whoop strap, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, and at the same time you want to support the channel, there are different affiliate links in the description below that do not cost you any extra, and some even provide a discount. By the way, if you want to track your general health in addition to your sleep, the Whoop strap is great, but also the Oura Ring can be an amazing device for some people, and videos on these two devices are linked right here. If, on the other hand, you want to know what is the best device depending on your budget, check out this video right here. Now, thank you so much for watching and catch you in the next video.